Welcome all to tonight's Tegeder Talk. I'm Peter Koenig. My great-grandfather settled to farm near Rush Lake in North Dakota in about the 1890s. My wife and I are raising our grandson, who is an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation in the Pigeon Clan. I have lived in North Minneapolis for the last 45 years, and I'm a member of the Indigenous outreach team at St. Francis Cabrini. I'll be hosting the program and managing the Zoom meeting this evening. As we begin our program, as we begin our evening together, let us acknowledge that we each stand on Indigenous land, whether Dakota, Ojibwe, or other tribal nation. Let us learn from our past, reconcile the present, and together create a future of justice, equity, and compassion. And now, I'll turn the program over to Jessica, our moderator.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. We cholo wanwashte we imachiapi kashto. My spirit name is Good Voiced Woman. I'm also known as Jessica Rousseau. My Tioshpae, my family, are people of the plains, Titanwan, and we belong to the Ocheti Shakowin, the Seven Council Fires. I'm Lakota from Cheyenne River in South Dakota, and I belong to the band of Itazipjo, Without Bows, Minikoju, Planters by the Water, and Oohe Numpa, Two Kettles. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're hopeful that you will be delighted and enlightened by tonight's discussion with Linda LeGarde Grover. Linda is a novelist, poet, and a short story writer. She's also a professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota at Duluth. Welcome, Linda.
Welcome. Bonjour, everybody. Linda LeGarde Grover, an Indigenous Gaye Nichque, sa Bikone Zagaiganing, Onamani Zagaiganing, Nindun Jaba, Gaye Anagamesing, Misabikang, Ojibwe Kwe Nin. I live in Duluth here, and I'm a Boys Fort enrollee, and I'm an Ojibwe person from northern Minnesota. My nickname Nijkwe means like it's like girlfriend. It's like a feminine version of buddy. And thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Linda. In your professional life, you study and you teach about federal policies which have had a major impact on the lives of Native American people. Yet your writing is often in fiction form rather than factual narratives. Would you tell us why you prefer using fiction as a means to educate us about federal policies?
I think that fiction can be more true than nonfiction. And traditionally, the way many Native, maybe all Native tribes, the way of teaching and learning, of passing down knowledge has been by storytelling and by keeping stories and paying very close attention to make sure that they're accurate and appropriately passed down, and then keeping them alive from generation to generation. And so in writing about fiction, I do think that probably what I'm writing is more true than more than I could write if I was writing a nonfiction paper. And I have to say that I started writing fiction with my aunts in mind, and what I thought they might like me to be saying from things that I learned from them and my uncles. And so with the storytelling, I feel like I'm holding on to a part of Ojibwe tradition that is essential to our survival as a people. And also people who might not necessarily pick up a book of nonfiction might pick up a novel and are starting to read about children at boarding school, or the girls in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in America, or the foster children today. They might start reading about something like that with the policies that I have inserted in there, and then, you know, become educated in that way through the reading of fiction.
That makes sense. So why are these stories so important?
Oh, our stories are, they're like, what would you call it? Our encyclopedias, our Bibles. They are our knowledge, and it's meant the survival of a people. Understanding how important it is to pass these stories on. One thing that I think is, a thing I love so much about Native ways of doing things is not every person knows all the stories. When we're talking about the old time recounting of history and the sacred stories which are interwoven with them, and the family histories and the tribal histories, these things are all parts are known by many people, and not one person holds all the knowledge. And so we are a web of knowledge, and that is our strength as a people too. I don't think we even want one person to know everything. We're all holding this up together.
Thank you so much for that. In your most recent book, In the Night of Memory, you write about people experiencing foster care, homelessness, land allotment, boarding schools, abuse. What motivated you to write this book?
I felt that there was a story that it's meant to be, that I tell in this way, with this part. And what I have is only one very, very small part of a large picture. And, I'm an Ojibwe woman from northern Minnesota here. And in Minnesota, the northern parts of Minnesota are Ojibwe lands. That's where our land cession treaties and our reservations have been established. And in the roughly southern half of Minnesota are the Lakota people, who have their own story as far as movement and removals and all kinds of interactions with federal and state government entities. And so when I'm telling these stories that are set against the backdrop of historical event and federal Indian policy, I want to bring things in that will show that these things have affected and continue to affect real human beings, real people. And that's why I do that. My first book of fiction, The Dance Boots, the springboard for that was the boarding school system. Probably hold that up in the air here. Ta-da, ta-da-da. My second book of fiction, The Road Back to Sweetgrass, the springboard for this was the federal termination policies after the Second World War through through the 1980s. And so in The Night of Memory, the springboard for this book is the experience of a more contemporary branch of the fictional extended family that I write about. And yeah, I mean, the vehicle for this in the first place was going to be the story of a couple of sisters who ended up in the foster system. And as I started writing, more emerged that connects to that, how in the world, how do children end up in fostering in the first place? These things don't happen like in a vacuum, that somebody just says, oh, look, there's a couple of girls, I think we'll put them into foster care. And there are many social issues connected with federal policy and historical event that lead up to this. And that's why I wanted to bring things like the boarding school as a background. I touch on that certainly in The Night of Memory, but also the loss of land and the movement on land. People in the past, well, I suppose today too, moved around a lot and not by choice, and moved from land that they they and their families were living on, and sometimes had been for a really long time. And so with the breaking up of lands and where people lived, and then the removal of people onto up north here in the reservation system, and then the dividing up of reservation land into individual land allotments for members of the band, that set into motion all kinds of things that are still with us today. Our legal identity up here as Indian people, our status, depends on our ancestors' interactions with the governments and what their land allotment situations were at the time, and how they have many times disintegrated over the last century or so.
Mm.
So, foster care is certainly connected to that. I mean, there's a lot of upheaval and turmoil in the history since Europeans arrived in this area here, and I did want to show that. I don't want to be beating people over the head who are reading this, and so I try to make it, kind of a gentle tone in this fiction, but at the same time, it is a story that needs to be told. So here is the story. Interact with it and take it in, and then do what you will with it as a fellow human being.
It all sounds so very complex and interwoven. So to kind of go back off of what you were saying, did the issues for us then begin with the loss of land? Did it become, what is kind of the starting point for a better understanding of what happened to Native people to get us to where we're at present day, in regards to your story around foster care with the two children?
We Ojibwe people originally migrated here from the northeastern part of this continent, and when we came here, we met other people who were here in the, so many times, I don't think we can apply the old Christopher Columbus story to any part of America where he landed in a ship and it was empty except for a few friendly folks who were bringing him gifts. There were people living all over the continent here, and so that movement began around the time of impact, and maybe of European impact here, and maybe even before that. And so that began something that over time has had a snowball effect on the people. And so with our moving here and Dakota people moving to the south of us, we already have a displacement of land right there. And we have displacement of families over a long period of time. And then once we had the reservations and the placements of the Dakota people the way they stand today, that is when I believe that, and I truly believe that these were good intentions. What are we going to do now? We've got this problem here, and the problem is the Native people. It's the Indians. In fact, when I was a girl, I often heard the term the Indian problem, which it confused me and distressed me. And how could we be such a problem by being here? And so to resolve this, a federal policy of assimilation, which would be to fold Native people all over the country into larger society, really was the backbone of this was the Indian boarding school system, which would remove children from their families, send them somewhere far away, teach them to be something that they were not. So they're kind of like reinventing Native people. And then ultimately they would not even want to go home and would disappear into society. And that's what the solution to the Indian problem really was. That's what assimilation was the disappearance of Indian people. So leading that into 20th century Indian policy, the boarding school system then created terrible problems in Indian country. All all programs having to do with Indians did. They were reviewed in the late 1920s by the federal government, commissioned the Merriam Report, which you might have heard of, and then great change and improvement was supposed to come in Indian country. So, and that was the time that many of our tribal governments, the way we see them today, were established. After the Second World War, the idea of assimilating once again reared its head, and how now will we really assimilate Native people into this country? We will do it through the dissolving of tribes as legal sovereign bodies, as nations. And so starting in the early 1950s, that was the aim of federal Indian policy, and it was called termination, and it meant the termination of tribes. And when you terminate a tribe, you are terminating the legal status and identity of there will be no more tribal members. Combine that with other things that are supposed to help solve the big problem, like the federal adoption project, where Native babies and children were removed from their families and adopted out to middle-class white families. I thought, well, this will be a nice assimilation process. Or the federal relocation program, which strongly encouraged young, promising Native people to move away from home and assimilate themselves in urban areas, which actually created large urban centers. Minneapolis was one of the destinations. You end up with a whole lot of Native people there, and the mass sterilizations by Indian Health Service of Native women, sometimes men, but mostly women, in the 70s. And so with that, the placement of Indian children away from their families and homes grew very rapidly, and that included foster care. And so even today, Native children are placed out of home at a higher rate, still a much higher rate than the larger population. And the reintegration of the children back into their homes and families then has more difficulties, I believe. The mechanics of it are just really, really difficult. And so we still have a breaking up of families under policies that today are supposed to have improved things.
What are these?
It's not like this is a hopeless situation, but I do think it's important for people to realize this.
Agreed. As an Indigenous woman, I understand the same thing too. I've heard the same fears and concerns that come with fostering young people, young Native people, because of everything you've just described. That young Native people are removed from their homes at such a higher rate than their non-Native counterparts, and it's really hard to get those families back into the homes. It instills a lot of fear in our communities. It still instills a lot of fear in our families.
Oops. Jessica, I seem to have lost the audio. Can you hear me?
I may be having a little bit of technical difficulties.
Okay, we're good now.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. So can you tell us then, what are the federal policies that are currently involved in foster care with Native families?
The big federal policy actually was passed in 1978, and that's the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so if you see it, ICWA, or people will talk about ICWA, or the ICWA workers, or people working for ICWA. What that has done is restored much of the say over what happens to Native children to the tribes. And it's done differently depending upon the tribe. There are actually tribes in Minnesota where they have councils of elders who will review these things case by case. And that has improved things. And as a byproduct of this, I don't think it was the intention, but it did actually strengthen our tribes and strengthen the sovereignty of our tribal bodies. And so ICWA has had a good effect. It is not perfect by any means. I mean, there are, people implementing and carrying these things out are, human beings and have, human strengths and human faults too. But that has truly made a difference. And so when a child is going to be placed somewhere, the tribe will often be involved in making that decision on whether they'll be placed at all, or if they, the object of this is to place them as close to family and community as possible. And that's what the review is for. There are Native children who are, certainly who are placed outside of Indian country and with non-Indian families. And it's not that this cannot be a good thing for them too, but the power of the tribe and just knowing that there is someone watching out for the families I think that's a great help. ICWA could certainly, in my opinion, have a little more muscle sometimes than it has. But overall, this is something that has been of help. ICWA inherited all kinds of terrible things in the late 1970s. It was chaotic, and it is taking a very long time to unsnarl some of the chaos.
So does a young person have to be enrolled in a tribe then to have tribal support helping them through the fostering process for ICWA?
That depends on the tribe. And if push comes to shove, and once in a while we read about that, we see it on the news about things going to court, the tribe then will determine how much it will be involved. There are parameters over which children can have this protection, but many times when the tribe chooses to become involved and say, under the Indian Child Welfare Act, this is what we are wanting to do, often then the tribe's wishes will prevail. But we've seen, I'm sure everybody here has seen, some really just heartrending stories on the national level of who can have the custody of this child, who has the legal right to this, to this child's presence. And so that is something that really has to go in the courts. When the tribes prevail, certainly this strengthens us as a people if we look at it through that lens of the tribes and tribal sovereignty. But it is, ICWA is not perfect. It does have flaws like everything else has, but overall it has been a tremendous plus.
Thank you so much for that. Moving a little bit into a different direction, but to touch back on some of the conversation that we had earlier. In several of your books, you write about boarding schools, and you talked a little bit about boarding schools and assimilation. But can we talk about boarding schools? Can you tell us, did this happen in Minnesota?
Oh yeah. Minnesota had many boarding schools because the Indian population here is pretty large. And so boarding schools began before America began, actually, with, first there were explorers coming into America, and they were bankrolled by governments and businesses in Europe. They were followed then by missionaries who originally were coming to keep an eye on the people who were coming in here. Like in the northern half of this continent, it was the fur trade. There's all these young males coming in from everywhere. So they were there to try to keep an eye on them, but the missions found that there was that looked like almost an endless supply of souls that could be saved. It was necessary to teach from the Bible. It was desirable that people could read these things for themselves. It was found that the easiest people to work with because they're so tender and so malleable are children. And so out of those very early days came some of the very first Indian schools for Indian children and boarding schools. Dartmouth College was built as a very small boarding school for what were seen as very promising young males. No females were invited. It's okay. The first class of Harvard, probably half, and there were only like about a dozen people, but I think maybe 5 or 6 of those students were young males. And so the churches started to get heavily involved as westward expansion was going on, and as missions were being built, boarding schools were being built. I mean, the Methodist Church got to Kansas like in 1830 and built a boarding school there. And the federal government started funding some of these in 1819 under President Monroe. But it wasn't until after the Civil War that the federal government got into the boarding school business in a big way. And education as an assimilation policy, as part of an assimilation policy then, drove what was happening with Indian families then for decades. This did not get, boarding schools started being dismantled like in the mid to late 1930s. So it took a while to build them, and it took a while to shut them down too. So several generations of Native children then were removed from home and went to boarding school. Now, not every child went to boarding school because they couldn't build them fast enough. And they had some reservation day schools run by both the federal government and the churches. At some point, the church schools had to they became like contract schools, and so they had to even kind of make their curriculum more even, across the board. But at all boarding schools, assimilation was the main purpose of those schools. So they had a three-pronged approach, but the most important was assimilating. The second was preparation for a vocation once they finished school, which I don't know, not all that many did. And then the third was the academic part. And so even though the education was supposed to be kind of even across the board, there were some schools where children actually did get some decent schooling, but it was not the same as regular schools, as regular public or private schools. The grades were different, the curriculum was different. So it was several generations. In my family, many people went to boarding school, and it became, from what I can see in my family, it became something that one of my uncles he really wanted me to know that the parents really had no choice. Schooling was declared compulsory in the 1880s for Indian children. They had to go to school. And so it just kind of really hurt your heart when he would tell me these things, because he'd say, my mother didn't want us to go. And I thought, well, of course, it was so important to him that we know in our family that his mother cared about the children very, very much, and that things were beyond her control. And in many ways, some people from my family, it's true, it really did scatter and break up many families. And mine is only one family and one family's story. And I know we've been luckier than a lot of people, but it's a devastation that continues with us. And I had a friend, a non-Native friend years ago, who just asked me once, because I was starting to study this when I went back to college when I was a mom, and she said, why would you even want to look at something like that? It's also negative and sad. It's a really sad history. And I thought, well, yeah, but it's our history. It is ours, and we reckon with it, and there's reason and purpose and beauty in everything we do. I mean, we were created to be here, and we don't always understand it,
Mm-hmm. And you were saying that in Minnesota, the boarding schools closed down around the 1930s. Is that what I heard correctly?
They began to close down. I think Pipestone was the last real big industrial type boarding school in southwestern Minnesota. And that closed, I think, in 1953. And I mean, Flandreau, just over the border, is still open. There are some boarding schools in America still, but they are very, very different from how they were during the boarding school era. So we say that the big boarding school era is like from 1879 to 1934, but boarding schools existed before that and they existed after that. I mean, I know people who went to Pipestone School in the early 1950s. I never had to.
I can also, just for clarification for our audience members, I've worked with many families who had elder caregivers that were products of boarding school, and their experience in boarding school was not it was not pleasant, and it has an impact even on today, in today's generation, with young people going to school. There's a lot of fear that comes with this because there's lived experience around this.
How do you go, and I've thought about this too, Jessica, and we talked a little bit a couple of days ago, I mean, the educating and the passing of knowledge is a sacred thing. And I have heard old people say, education is sacred, get all the education you can. And how do you reconcile something that is so important, so sacred? Only the very most trusted and honored people would be, are like the teachers in old days were so revered for what they were doing. And then how do you take that concept and twist it into something that was so destructive and so terrible? And yeah, it's school makes many Native people, institutional school makes us uneasy. We don't sit comfortably with it.
Mm-hmm. I've heard, and it's worth exploring a little bit more. But one of the phrases used to describe the young people that I've worked with in the past is, you essentially have a young person who's walking in two very different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
They're walking in their world of their, indigenous identity, and they're also walking in the world of modern day society. And sometimes both of those worlds conflict. And so there's been these lasting impacts on our communities that we're still learning to heal from.
Mm-hmm. And to reconcile those two things, we want our children to do well in school. I've worked in K-12 education, and I don't even know how many parents even flat out said, I want her to do good in school. I want her to graduate. I want her to go to college. But how do you get from where you are to what your dream is? And that's what our Indian education programs in our public schools do. I appreciate them very much.
Agreed. I would like to take this quick moment to remind our audience that if you have questions, please feel free to submit them via chat to questions for Linda, and use this opportunity right now to actually talk about what can we do to reconcile. I'd like you, Linda, to talk about our loss of first languages. It seems that the federal policies are meant to force assimilation into the culture of the immigrants from Europe. It resulted in a suppression of Indigenous languages and culture. What were the results of these policies? So can you talk about the impact that these policies and loss of language had on our people, and maybe how we're starting to use regaining our language as a strength for our communities and the healing that comes with that?
Well, they were not allowed to speak their own language at boarding school ever. And so, there were children who went to school who didn't speak any English at all or spoke very limited English. And had to be, what's the word? Is it submersion? Immersion. Submersion is a good word. But nowadays there are people who pay a lot of money to send their children to immersion camp to learn Spanish or German or French in the summertime. But this was really brutal in the boarding school system. And so for many, many years, terrible things happened to children sometimes who spoke their language either because they forgot or because they were asserting themselves. I mean, the boarding schools were brutal places. I mean, there was physical punishment, there's corporal punishment. And my uncles have told me things about the school at Hayward, Wisconsin, where they had an actual dungeon in the basement of a building where children were locked for being disobedient and actually fed bread and water, just like in the old prison movies. And so the language really was beaten out of a large number of people. And then when they came back home, lots of times the older people didn't speak it to their children at all because they did not want them to suffer the way they had. And so out of very kind hearts, the language in many communities all but disappeared. In recent decades, there's been a great effort for the revitalization of native languages. I could not have imagined such a thing when I was a child in school. When I was a kid, when I heard my relatives talking Indian, they would the aunts, and I mean, they seemed really old to me. They were probably in their 30s. Come to think of it, but they would, when they'd say something, they'd like they'd done something naughty, and it made me feel kind of bad, but also very, very confused. But nowadays, it is because of we actually owe it to the people who were the activists, like in the 1960s and 70s, the American Indian movement folks, and they're still with us too. And I have to credit them a lot for bringing pressure to have some of these things actually happen in our schools. One of my grandsons, and he's 26 years old now, but he was going to Head Start at Fond du Lac at the reservation, just close by us here, and he was playing by himself in a corner of the front room one day, and one of my uncles is there, and he's really old. And my grandson's singing this little song to himself, and my uncle said, "Well, what's that he's singing? What's what is that?" And he was singing this "Boozhoo everybody" and "Wave to a Niji" and a preschool song. And so, my uncle, we kind of hauled him out and said, sing that for your Uncle Bob there. And, he's like, "Oh no." And he finally did. And my Uncle Bob, he laughed in pleasure at this. And since then, I mean, I have grandchildren who've been able to actually take Ojibwe language as class in school. And we only have the 2 high schools in Duluth here, but students can take Ojibwe at both the high schools and I think at both the middle schools. And programs that support cultural and educational aspects are there in our schools. And that with these are run by real grassroots committees. What are they called? Indian Education Committee. We always just call it the Parent Committee, and it consists of almost all parents of Native children. And they make decisions on what the Indian education program will do. And in Duluth here and many other places, the kids then are able to take language. I never thought, when I was a girl in school, never dreamed of any such thing, or dreamed that I would ever see an American Indian teacher. It never occurred to me that could happen. And yet now I have 2 daughters who are preschool teachers, and they have little children that they work with. And I just, I think, we're doing it for you, for the people who really suffered a lot in education.
Right. I also back at home for me, our reservation, when I was 14, they mandated that every young person in school, K through 12, had to begin taking Lakota language and had to pass to graduate, which is absolutely amazing. Back when I was 14, it just felt like another class I had to take. I maybe didn't appreciate it as much as I do today. And there's it's a beautiful thing to be able to see your people talk in their language and understand their language, and recognize that the language is it's really meaningful for us.
Mm-hmm.
That oftentimes a word is not just a word. So for instance, in our language, we don't have a word for love or hate at all. You can like something really a lot, or you can dislike something significantly, but you don't actually, there's no word for love or hate because it's a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
So there's expressions that come with these words. And I think it really gives purpose to our people when you understand that.
It does. That makes me think, Jess, because when I was a young mother and my kids were in school, and they're, somebody's going to come and speak a little language for it. Everybody wants to know how you say "I love you," and in those days, the older people would say, "Well, there isn't a word for "I love you." I mean, now there is. I think somebody finally made a word, so people use it just all the time, and which is, I mean, that's fine. But it was explained to us that you show this by your actions, how you act, that people will know that you love them, that it's much more than the word. And the words we have very great meaning and very broad meaning. A word, our word for thank you, miigwech, I mean, is everywhere all the time. I mean, I was raised with that as being the most important word in Ojibwe language that you can know. If you're going to know one word, know this one, because it means everything across the board.
And to clarify for our audience members, Linda and I both come from, I'm Lakota, she's Ojibwe, so we come.
Oops, Jess, I think we lost sound again.
Am I back?
You're back.
Oh, okay. I think it's the rain. It's the rain. Had beautiful 70-degree weather the last week, and all of a sudden the night we get the rain coming through. And let's just put it this way: you're gonna hear what you need to hear tonight.
It's what is meant to be.
Exactly. So again, audience members, please let me remind you to continue to submit your questions via chat to questions for Linda. I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about something else that is going to be a little bit heavier, Linda. And I would like for you to tell us a little bit more about what I'm about to talk about, and tell us why you write about this in your book. And what I'd like to bring into discussion right now is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Most often, we hear it most often referred to as MMIW.
Mm-hmm. It's only in recent years that we actually have that acronym MMIW, to missing and murdered Native women and girls and guys too. That is very sadly, that is nothing new in our communities. I think every family I know has a story about a woman or some people in their family who disappeared or were badly hurt or were killed. Everybody, every family, and we have these very large extended families. Everybody has always known this, and I'm really, I'm glad to see that there is attention being paid to this, and that we see it in the news, and that when a young person, when a young woman goes missing, nowadays with Facebook and stuff, we often see these things shared all over the place. I don't think that these things were, I just don't think that we were thought of as being important enough to merit a lot of attention to this until we decided for ourselves that we needed to absolutely make it clear that our people are precious to us, including our young women. In the night of memory, the two girls are in foster care, not because somebody just thought they'd put them in foster care, but because their mother was in a situation in life where she had no choice and had to turn them over to the county. They ended up in foster care, and their mother then disappeared. And in this book, then, that is a hole in the lives of these girls, but not just these two little girls as they grow up, but everybody else in their community too. It becomes one of those things about, well, before Loretta went missing, or, well, when Loretta was a little girl, this really sad thing happened, and we, people just weren't able to hang on and to keep things together. And so a tragedy in one young life then repeated itself in other young lives. And and in this book, then, through the Indian Child Welfare Act and through extended traditional Native families and values, the girls eventually are brought back to live with relatives. But it makes you feel terribly, terribly, terribly sad thinking about this as being just a part of being a Native person in America. It's been this way all my life, and I know it was this way before I was even born, because in my family there's a woman who has never been found. Nobody knows what harm befell her. There are no records of her ever working anywhere or living anywhere in a census after a certain date. What has happened to these people? And so I really appreciate, once in a while you'll see that downtown or something, there'll be a vigil or something. Up here there's a mother who's been missing now for probably 5 years, and every year there's a vigil, and people remember and they speak about her, and they keep this on our minds, so that when something happens to a young person, right away there are people watching, and we watch our girls. In the old days, people watched their young people and took very, very good care of them, and this was broken up by impact of um, settler kinds of stuff. And so we are gaining that back ourselves too. I mean, our kids are so precious to us. I mean, as we were to to our parents and grandparents, and we didn't realize it, and our kids, I think, don't realize, when they say children are our future, I mean, with Native people, they are what carries us forward. And I know Jess and I, we were talking, I was saying, my gosh, it's kind of a heavy, I hope we are not burdening them with the tremendous expectation that we have, combined with our great love for them.
Agreed. Yeah, this is a difficult subject to talk about as a mom. I'm a mom.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughter is 9, and we've already had to have conversations around, if anything should ever happen, you fight for your life, because it literally could be life and death, because there is so much fear in our communities that if you go missing, there's not going to be any attention given to you. It's very, it's scary. And like you were saying, Linda, I came from a community that we looked out for each other.
Mm-hmm.
But that's home for me. Like, that's what we do back at home. But now I'm in a metropolis, and things happen here. I mean, they happen, more than we would hope for them to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me, for clarification, there's the color red that's associated with MMIW. What does red symbolize?
For me, I'm not sure what I even know that it symbolizes. For me, there are the four colors, the number 4 and the importance of that. It's people wear it. I mean, there are women who wear red shawls. I have one myself. There are the symbols, the handprint symbols. What do you see in this, Jess?
I've heard that it was a healing color.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're from Minneapolis, I think it was a couple years ago, there was at the Minneapolis American Indian Center, a really significant display of red dresses to
Mm-hmm.
symbolize women who are missing, women, girls, and young men too, who are missing or murdered. And every February now there is a march that takes place. And so you'll see the people who are involved in this, everybody wears red. And yes, the hand that's painted, either, on their garments or on their body. Uh, it's sad that this is happening, it has happened, but it's also really invigorating to see us come, and raise awareness around this in this way.
I think so. And, up here too, I have seen, since there is a heightened awareness of this, I have seen young women found
Yes.
who you think 10 years ago, 5 years ago, would there have been an all-out mobilization of the community to look for a young woman who is missing for whatever reason? Maybe she made a really, really bad decision and got herself in some real trouble. But we do see young women occasionally now found and returned. And I know that wouldn't happen if we didn't have these folks. And this is all volunteer time on their part. And it's the psychic energy in this, and the what it takes out of their souls to do this. They are, people who are doing this are truly warriors for our women and our young people.
Yes, agreed. Okay, I have one more short discussion point before we move into break. So we've talked a lot about a number of issues that you have raised awareness around in your literature, in our discussions, but there's also a lot of information that has been omitted, a lot of history that has been omitted in schools, history, facts about what happened to Native Americans as the settler movement progressed westward. It just isn't, it's gone. It's not in some of the history books. It's not taught in the schools. Some of these omitted topics include the termination policy, treaties and how they were created and dishonored, tribal government and sovereignty. Linda, why do you suspect that these topics have been omitted from traditional learning platforms?
Things move very slowly. And even though I'm sure there are plenty of people who would be willing to have this included in the curriculum, there are not all that many Native people in the decision-making areas of educational curriculum. And I think that for a while there, when they were reprinting social studies book, it's always social studies, right? They would have some little column to the right-hand side of every couple pages with this little addition here about the Native Americans. Well, which was, I suppose, it was a beginning. But yeah, the curriculum I think it needs an overhauling. I think that tacking on something to be inclusive sometimes segregates things even further, because they think, well, how come I belong in this little box on this little side of the page here? Is my history not part of the real history? Is it not valid? Is there something wrong with it? Something, how you feel as a young person. And so I don't know if a lot of progress is really being made here. So many classroom teachers, I know we're on, lockdowns with things right now because of the illness, but so often teachers will want guests to come into their class, to come in and tell them all about these things. And it's really very, very sad, because obviously this stuff is not in the curriculum, and a teacher who even wants to do something doesn't even know where to begin. And there are so few Native teachers. We need more Native teachers. We need more Black teachers. We need more Latinx teachers. We need to diversify the teaching staff, up where I live, I think, especially. And so I think people would be willing to do this, but they don't know what to do. And our curriculumers, they're just sad to look at it, page through a social studies book,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really am appreciative of your initial response to that question. The first thing I wrote down was good answer. Things are moving really, really slowly, but I'd like to say that we're moving in the right direction. Um, we're trying, we are trying, we know that we're far and few in between Native professionals in various capacities.
Oop, lost you again, Jess.
Did you lose me again?
You're back, but you're back.
I think when I say something extremely profound, I
It's too profound for the technology.
just to sum up what I was saying though, is like we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, I do think that we are. I don't think that we're going backwards on this, and I don't think that we will.
Correct.
I do feel, I've been around for a while, and I do feel an empowerment in dealing with systems that I did not feel when I was a young mother, when my kids started school.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's see. So we're kind of about that time right now, where we're gonna take a short break. We will reconvene in approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jessica and Linda. And I will talk a bit about the Tegeder Talks. And St. Francis Cabrini is excited to continue Father Mike Tegeder's legacy of encouraging adult conversations about vital topics. Father Mike Tegeder was a former pastor at St. Francis Cabrini and simultaneously priest for Gitchitwa Kateri Catholic Church. Mike has been described as follows. He's been described in many ways, but here's a couple from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Fearless, a rare bird, and a burr under the saddle of authority. The Reverend Mike Tegeder was all those things, according to those who know him. Mike was never afraid to speak up or get his hands dirty on behalf of others, whether that meant bucking the Catholic hierarchy or showing up with a trailer to help someone move. Another quote, a lot of people are drawn to people with connections to power, but Mike was drawn to people who didn't have the power and stood up for them. He saw inequities in the world and was on a mission to fix them. He was one of the great souls of the earth. Mike's passionate resolve for justice includes his love of all creation, including nature and the environment. This connected well in his relationship with Gitchitwa Kateri Church. His relationship with Kateri and Cabrini created a bridge between us, an added legacy gift from Father Mike, which continues today. We remember Mike's legacy by facilitating adult conversations about vital topics, which challenge our thinking around Catholic theology and social justice, such as tonight's conversation.
Again, this is a reminder, I'm Jess, and we're having a conversation with Linda. The first segment of our conversation showcased and highlighted various topics that have impacted Native people through the literature forms that she has created for us to purchase. So go out and grab her books and read if you want to know a little bit more about this. But as we're back here now, I want us to be able to try to get through most of your questions. So we did have an overwhelming response of questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can with time allotted. And as we proceed forward, Linda, in our conversation with you, we've talked about policies that have caused great harm to Indigenous people. This discussion has been thought-provoking, to say the least, as we can tell in our questions that have come through. And I'm confident that our audience members have already begun to think about ways in which they can be helpful about the topics that we've discussed tonight. However, before moving any of these ideas forward, I would like to ask you for any recommendations that you may have to help our audience as they formulate their thoughts and their next steps. But before you begin, I would like to provide some recommendations of my own. Audience, please understand that in Western society, BIPOC people, that's BIPOC, POC, it's an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, are oftentimes made invisible. Take, for instance, our recent election statistics that made an ignorant assumption that the Indigenous vote was considered something else. We were not identified as white, Latino, Black, or Asian. Sadly, this example is one of many where Indigenous thought, voice, and contributions have been left out of conversation. Tonight, I invite audience members to understand that in dominant society, the cultural norm is to dominate conversation. I've participated in countless conversations regarding working with BIPOC communities and have witnessed my non-BIPOC colleagues habitually dominate these conversations, most often by being the first to answer questions that could have been more appropriately answered by a BIPOC person. When we do not create space to authentically allow for BIPOC people to speak, we hurt our BIPOC relatives. If we're truly being supportive, we must remember to pause and allow for these relatives to be the first to answer these questions. Let us remember to exercise self-awareness and not make any assumptions about knowing what is best for people of color. So with that, I have questions that I'm going to begin asking you, Linda.
Okay.
And very, very excited to hear the responses. Our first question that came to us tonight is, I understand that Native peoples do not get voting rights, voting in the larger USA elections until sometime in the middle of the last century. Is that true? If so, when?
1924 is when American Indians were made citizens of the United States, kind of a blanket decision by Congress. There were Native people who were citizens before that, citizens already for various circumstances they had. In 1924, once you became a citizen, you're supposed to be able to vote. That doesn't mean that people actually got to vote, though, because there were holdouts on the state level, many places across the country, and I think some places in Maine held out until 1957. That's pretty recent time. So when I say the 1924 is, that's when the federal government said, yes, you are citizens, and that includes voting rights, but it doesn't mean that actually people got to.
Thank you. Our next question this evening. Could you tell me the reason you are called Anishinaabe as well as Ojibwe?
I like that question. If you see the word Chippewa, that means pretty much the same thing. And our up north, our government is called the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, and it's a federation of 6 bands. And so Chippewa is similar to Ojibwe, the word I use. Some people think Ojibwe was closer to the original word. Some people think Chippewa is closer to the original word. But the word Anishinaabe is an Ojibwe word that it is, my aunt used to call it a generic word for being Indian. It can be used in 2 ways. One is very specifically Ojibwe, and the other is all the people. So we pray a lot. We're always praying. I mean, before we eat, before we have tribal council meetings, somebody's praying. Sometimes they pray for a really long time. And you can hear the words, even if you don't speak the language. The Anishinaabe, they mean everybody. The translation, the old time way, what I've been told is that it means spontaneously created being, made by the creator, by Gijemanidu, the great spirit, spontaneously, bam, and then gently lowered to the earth, where all would be provided and where we would be good and excellent human beings. So I like the word.
Well, yeah, I like it too. Talk about establishing purpose and meaning, right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Your next question up. Some relatives cannot register with their people because their father was not registered. Their grandparents were registered, but they have little contact with their heritage. Could they be recognized in some way? I traced some of their ancestors in censuses on one reservation.
Membership is up to the individual tribe. And so, and it is not even as simple as that. To change a tribal constitution is a big deal. And ultimately, the Bureau of Indian Affairs needs to allow it. It's a very complicated, lengthy process. We don't all, just like everyone else, we don't always all agree with all of the decisions that our government makes or has made. And it's up to us then as individuals within our tribe to make efforts to change things where we think they ought to be. I mean, I have really, really strong opinions about that with my own tribe, and many people do. And so is tribal enrollment the requirement? Is this set in stone? No, but things move very slowly. And I surely wish these people well. The fact that you have a number, sad. Whoever wanted a number in the first place? My grandmother would have been like, why are they giving you numbers? But the fact is and it means that you're a member of a federally recognized tribe. And so, it is a desirable thing to be enrolled in your tribe. But the fact that you're not, and we have many descendants up north here who are not eligible for enrollment under all kinds of old, we would call them blood quantum rules that go back to the land allotments and the records in the land allotment land transactions, who just aren't eligible for enrollment. But this does not mean that they are not Native people. So yeah, I certainly, I really, really understand that for that family, and surely, hope for the best for them.
Can you hear me, Linda?
I can now.
Okay, good. Just to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just to kind of sum up that, that was a very, really wonderful, informative answer, because I know that we could have a whole discussion, another discussion on tribal enrollment, lineage, blend quantum, all of the above. A quick follow-up to that. So we.
Oops, just lost sound.
Can you hear me, Linda?
Now I can.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, Lord, again. But a quick follow-up to that is what I was asking was, can somebody be enrolled in two tribes?
As far as ours is concerned, no. So I suppose that would be up to an individual tribe, but I know with our Minnesota Chippewa tribe, no, that is not possible. You do have to choose. And I know there are people who are, have parents and grandparents in different tribes, and that gets very complicated too, as far as what your legal blood quantum is in each tribe. But ours is no, you choose one of them.
Same thing with ours. Yep. All right, our next question. What would be different or better if the boarding schools never existed? How would education of Indian populations worked into where we are at this point in time?
Our tribes were educating the young as far back as there were people. And so education is a sacred thing, sacred trust, and people have always been educated. And I expect if there weren't boarding schools, they would have continued to be educated. And so I think where what I'm trying to differentiate between here is like formal assimilationist schooling, as opposed to the other type of education that's always gone on.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question. Do non-Native people ever participate in Native language classes? And is that something to be avoided or discouraged?
there are non-native people who take up at UMD where I work. There are always non-native people in classes. I had a friend who was going to St. Scholastica in the 70s, and they had started their Indian education program with language. And he said he had to work really, really hard in language class because there were nuns in the class too. He said, and they were always the best students, so that he had to work really hard so he wouldn't have to be embarrassed by not being a really good student. So he said that was a real incentive. But you know, I don't know, there's always non-native people in, you know, college and high school classes that I see. When we have language table here, and you know, which is a gathering that a community organization puts on where people can come and practice or try with the language, there's people who bring a non-native friend there and stuff. They're welcome.
Yep. All right. Can you give some examples of where Native culture and non-Native cultures conflict?
You know, we in a lot, I guess a lot of it comes to child rearing and how you raise your child to be. And so we've always, in our old time ways of doing things, a person who is thinking about something, we think that you know, so they're not jumping in with an answer, they're reflecting a lot, they're observing and reflecting. We think that person is showing signs of being on their way to wisdom, you know. But in a classroom, you know, there are children who are jumping up and down in their seat and waving their hand and stuff, who will get called on, and maybe, you know, maybe a native child knows the answer or hasn't finished thinking about it yet. And so that type of so it's almost like a social interaction in a classroom that I've seen. So, you know, I'd say we all have the same, I think people have the same values wherever you go, but I think it's your priorities and what is considered the proper etiquette as far as how you're going to interact with others. So that's one example that I see. Also, in our way of doing things, and I think this is really important, that we have our own spiritual religious beliefs, and we don't proselytize or try to get people to join our religion. And so in that way, we are really, and I think all Native religions are probably like this. And so in that way, we are really different from, you know, all the Christian religions I know, where they go, well, yeah, come to church, you know. That is a big difference that I see.
Those are very good examples. I want to comment on the first one that you had talked about with education and young people. When I was a young professional, I did a brunt of work around educational advocacy with Native kids. And I remember sitting in a presentation that helped me to understand that pace, tempo, tone all make a difference when it comes to education and little kids. And the example that he used was, because we're taught to be so observant from birth on up. I mean, this is why we have our cradle boards, that when a kindergartner comes into school, they're quiet, they're observant of their world. Most often they're met by a teacher who is really excited in how they convey information. So for example, hi, how are you? You know, and they're like super duper excited. Okay, but here's what it says to a young person, a young Native person. The last time they heard a tone, if they were to hear a tone like that, it meant emergency for them. Because if their parents are speaking in that high-pitched tone, there is something wrong. You know, so there's some contradictions that take place just even in those settings, that we just tend to speak at a slower pace, you know, where in schools you hear things moving very fast in conversation. It doesn't mean that these young people don't understand. We just don't we don't speak at the same pace. And so it was really informative to hear this different examples of the confliction that oftentimes young kids were faced with. So anyways, thank you for that answer. Next question. Please speak of your experiences of reservation life. What would you say about assumptions made by white people regarding Native communities?
We're really a diverse people, just like everywhere else. I mean, Jess and I are from two different tribes that our languages are really different from each other. Our religious beliefs are we are, you know, we're a woodland culture up here, and the Dakota people, most of them are plains culture, and so I mean it goes back in so many ways, and so often people will just think, you know, Native American, Indian person, and I think that creates a great deal of confusion, because I know I would never speak for a Lakota person, and I'm sure no, Jess would never speak for Ojibwe, and so that's, you know, there are big differences that way. The reservation where I belong is it's not only a small reservation, but it's a small section of a small reservation that's quite removed from the large land allotment area. And so it's a very small community. And it's, I mean, you know how it is up north. I mean, it's lovely. I mean, there's lakes and trees and woods, and, you know, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's, you know, we have a little casino up there, and that casino has made a big difference in jobs. Not everybody gets to work there, and I don't know if anybody makes a lot of money, but it's made it possible for the reservation community to be more self-sufficient, and also employs a pretty good number of non-native people from the area too, and the mines have gone belly up, and so so it's a beautiful place. You know, big city stuff has encroached, but it has in lots of small rural communities. I love it.
Thank you for bringing to discussion self-sufficiency, because I did grow up on the reservation. I moved here 20 years ago, and have called, you know, Minneapolis my home. But my experience on the reservation as a kid was when we had non-natives come in, there was an assumption that non-natives would make things better for us, that they could give us things we couldn't necessarily.
Oops, it's again.
Being mindful that when we have our non-native relatives coming in, that we might not have a.
Oh, sound just went.
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Goodness, I don't know when you can't hear me. That's the problem. Is it?
I try to go like this a little bit, and
yeah. Well,
so
I would, just to sum up what I was trying to say was, like, never make the assumption that you know, like, because when I was a kid, I felt, you know, that people came in and had the assumption that we were just poor Indian people. The reality is like, we don't we lack materialistic wealth, but it wasn't something that was important to us. And so we do have what we need. We value, we define wealth in very different ways, and traditional knowledge and family relationships, and like all of so many other things other than money. You'll actually see us give away things to show that we want to honor somebody. We have, you know, ceremonies that do that, just that we call giveaway ceremonies. So never to make these assumptions that we don't have what we need, because most often, you know, we just are not defining things the same, and we're placing value on differences. All right, we're kind of coming to an end, and I have just a few more questions to go before we finish out. So the next question was Lakota, Dakota. Can you give us any background? I feel like you might have done a little bit of that in the last answer to the question that we just answered. But what are the roots or the differences in the tribal groups? Was there a split, or how did the two tribes distinguish themselves from one another? You missed that question for me, huh?
Oh no, I heard it. I couldn't. I didn't want to answer it.
Lakota and Dakota. So the difference between the two is the dialect, geographical region. I don't have the expertise to answer the difference between the tribal groups. I only know kind of where I come from and the community that I come from. And Lakota communities, like I said when I made the introduction, we belong to the 7 council fires, that there are very distinct tribal communities, and that we each come from bands.
Oops, lost again.
Am I back?
You're back now. Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry about this.
No.
But anyways,
it's gone again.
Am I back?
Now you are.
I've decided that Creator doesn't need me to answer that question.
Hey.
Okay, so we are just gonna move forward and get to the next question. We have a fine audience tonight, Linda, who might be curious to know some of the questions that are relevant to, how to support Native people. One of those questions that comes to us tonight is, how can non-Native people show support and solidarity without appropriating in offensive ways? Can you tell us what cultural appropriation is before answering that question?
That is a really good question. I'm so glad it is here. Appropriation is taking aspects of another culture and another people for yourself. It's just like picking plums off a tree or something. I think I'd like this one, I'd like this one. So it is really not very respectful to do that. And I know sometimes there have been people who, I think when they've done this, they try to perhaps make their appearance or wear some clothing or something that they think that they are doing this to fit in and show respect to the group. But I think people need to be very, very careful about what you're going to do. And always never overdress and outdress a Native person. I mean, with some of these things, I've seen people who look like they might be really prosperous, non-Native people, show up at an event where we're having a Native speaker or something, and they're dressed in very expensive Indian type stuff, they think, with a lot of fringe and beads and turquoise and feathery things and all kinds of stuff, and they're with a room full of people who are very low income people who I don't know if they'd ever buy that for themselves anyway. So it's kind of embarrassing. Or I mentioned last time we talked about, we had at a small, we have little powwows up here once in a while, and there was, and this wasn't an isolated time, that a man went out into the powwow circle and just started like boogieing and doing whatever he thought was free form. It was pretty wild, and nobody knew what to do with him. And he was obviously not aware that he was not dancing. He didn't know the reasons for the way we dance, the different types of dance. He didn't pay attention to basic powwow etiquette, which is to kind of watch and observe, and very quietly, when you feel fairly sure of yourself, go and do something, and never make a spectacle of yourself. And so that type of thing, or gosh, where do you draw the line? I'm somewhere and I'll see some guy show up with a Red Power t-shirt and he's not a Native guy. And I feel like he's kind of trying on what he thinks might be how it feels to be an oppressed person or something. And I know that he's wanting to do the right thing and be nice, but I think it doesn't work well that way. Or to decide that you want to sit down next to a Native person, you see somewhere, this has actually happened to me, to tell them that, yeah, well, I have a spirit animal. And you just go, oh my, it's, my aunt used to just say, my grandma too, oh, that's nice, and I have to start doing that because I'm just, kind of at a loss for words and things like that. So I think the thing to do is to observe the way we teach our children, just watch, pay attention. If you're going to err on the side of something, err on the side of being on the shy side. To be supportive, I think educating oneself is so important. Um, the good questions we've had here in wanting to learn and to be educated. I mean, once a person knows these things, then there isn't going back. You've opened the door to something, and look in your heart too. Sometimes the support is very, very small. Volunteering to be a reading buddy with a child, or volunteering to help with something really basic at elder housing, can mean everything. Up here, somebody who brought a sweater to a lady in elder housing who didn't seem to know a lot of people, that meant everything in the world. And it might have changed that lady's life, that somebody thought to bring her a lavender sweater for Christmas. So, I mean, there's big things and small things, but I myself would recommend, starting small, small, doing small servant oriented kinds of things. Donate $5 to something. That's small as a start, right?
Agreed. Yep. That's most often our Native organizations could use financial support.
Mm-hmm.
It's the non-Native orgs, the more easily recognized organizations or businesses that usually get the donations. But we were talking earlier even about like language revitalization, we have to find and hire people who know these particular areas of expertise and know how to work with our kids. That costs money, so that's always helpful. And moving forward to another question before we close up.
Whoops, lost the...
All right, Linda, how can we express our respect and appreciation to Native Americans? Are there ways we can attempt to stand with or offer support and advocacy in any ways? What do we need to learn? And how can we keep learning how to try to become allies? What is your wish that we take from this evening? Please know we appreciate the opportunity to hear what both Linda and Jessica have shared this evening. Thank you so very much. So another question in regards to advocacy, standing, support, ways to become allies, and what is your wish that we take away from this evening?
To continue learning. And if you have questions, if you wonder if it's appropriate, you really want to go and stand and support at something, ask someone, would it be all right if I did this? Would it be all right if I stand here with you? And, I think, sometimes just asking a person first. I mean, always, err on the side of being, a little on the shyer and quieter side. But, I think keep learning. I mean, there's tons of stuff available on the internet. There's much that can be read. There activities. I know now we don't do a lot in person, but that you can look at or to see, and keep looking, keep reading, and and keep a good heart.
Thank you so much for that, Linda. That's going to conclude our questions for the evening. There are a number of other questions that are still have yet to be answered. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. But we simply have run out of time. So as we are nearing the conclusion of tonight's broadcast, I would like to be very vulnerable with you all. As a woman of color, we must embrace the strength and courage of Linda and myself who have participated in tonight's discussion. As I've expressed before, some of the dialogue that you've heard may have caused some discomfort. This discomfort, we BIPOC people are faced with every single day. As we educate non-natives of our identity and history, we experience hurt, pain, and trauma that come along with these discussions. If you must take only one thing with you today from me, it's a very strong and bold statement that I'd like to make to you all. You must earn the privilege of hearing the experiences and narratives that come from a BIPOC person.
And we lost.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Oh, goodness. I laugh a lot because it's a healing. It's a form of healing. And I've had to laugh throughout this whole conversation, considering what's going on here. But I was just saying, Pilama Yaye. And that means thank you, Linda, in my language. So from my heart, thank you. Audience members, thank you all. Pilama Yaye to you all as well. The recording of tonight's discussion will be made available by the Tegeder Talks committee, and it can be seen on the Tegeder Talks YouTube channel. You can also expect to receive a follow-up email containing resources and activities. I will not end tonight's conversation with a goodbye, farewell. We talked earlier about there's some words that we just don't have, and we don't have a word for goodbye. We just don't say it because we know that eventually we're going to see you again. So the word in my language that we say is doksha. We'll see you later.
Okay. Gigawabamin. We will see each other again.
Yep. Mitakuye oyasin, because we are all related. We're all relatives.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Jessica, for your time with us tonight and providing us with your insights and experiences. We look forward to continue our growth in understanding and nurturing healthy relationships between diverse communities. Thank you all for attending. And as Jessica mentioned, there will be follow-ups, and we will see you again. Peace and good night.